Good day, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Belonging Project. The word Ubuntu became popular worldwide during apartheid as Bishop Desmond Tutu explained a philosophy in multiple South African ethnic groups, that our humanity derives from the humanity of the collective. Ubuntu symbolizes the universal bond we have as a people and the focus on collective responsibility. Just as the pandemic has illustrated how interdependent we are, this collective is focused on working together to move toward our shared commitment to improving inclusion and diversity in the legal profession. We believe that we rise and fall together. Built on this concept, the Belonging Project is a collaborative network of professional and personal support for diverse legal talent across industry, organizations, and law firms. The Belonging Project offers opportunities and programs to support diverse law students and lawyers during the pandemic. The initiative contributes to diversity in the legal profession and encourages others to contribute and leverage their expertise and resources. And that's what brings us here today. My name is Janai Gibbings-Bailey. I am the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the law firm Perkins Coie. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm really excited to be joined by my co-presenter, Jamie.
Thanks, Janai. Hi, I'm Jamie Delu. My pronouns are she, her, and ella in Spanish for those Spanish speakers who might be on the line. I am a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategist. I also do a considerable amount of intercultural coaching. My most recent role was as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Boston Consulting Group. And I have had the pleasure of working with Corey and Janai through many, many years as a diversity and inclusion leader. So we're excited to be here with you today.
Terrific. Thank you, Jamie. And a shout out to Corey, who I know is in the audience today.
Yes.
So the title of today's webinar is Inclusive Conversations When We Are Worlds Apart. This pandemic has certainly highlighted the inequities and the divisions that exist in our society. Additionally, politics and political ideologies have driven even deeper divisions among all of us. Add on to that, America's reckoning with race. In the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, this has resulted in the need for many urgent, impassioned, and often challenging conversations. However, these are necessary conversations, and conversations that we should embrace because they can help us see each other better, help us hear one another better, and help us value one another better. So our goal today is to empower you to have more constructive, inclusive conversations, be it one-on-one or in larger groups. And we also want to help empower you to empower others to have more constructive conversations as well. We can move to the next slide. So we're going to start out by just laying the foundation with a few primers about inclusive leadership, facets or dimensions of diversity, and the value of intercultural competence. I'm just going to pause for 1 second. I hear someone typing in the background. If I could just ask everyone to mute, except for those of us who are speaking. Thank you. We're also going to talk about the necessary pre-work to inclusive conversations. We'll provide some tools and tactics to employ while actually having the conversation, so when you're in the thick of it. We'll also identify some common pitfalls to be aware of, and we look forward to reserving some time for your questions and comments as well. So regardless of the title that we have or the role that we play in our organizations, we are all leaders. We are leading from every seat. And as leaders, we have many opportunities to engage in ways that are more inclusive. For instance, when recruiting for talent, if we're a member of the committee, the recruiting committee, we may be able to ask questions about the process, challenge the process or the policies or procedures a little bit to encourage more inclusion, to encourage an analysis of whether or not there is bias built into the system. If we are a leader that's in a position to draft new policies and recommend new processes and procedures for those recruiting efforts, we can do that as well. Same thing with building teams and leading teams. As a team member, you may question the lack of diversity on that team. As someone who is creating the team and leading the team, you may be in a position to actually be very intentional about seeking out diversity and leveraging that diversity on the team. The same is true when communicating and providing a space for more inclusive conversations among all of the members of your organization or the people in that conversation. Each of us, every one of us, has the opportunity to model the behaviors that contribute to more inclusive conversations. So inclusive of what? What are we talking about here? I don't want to make any assumptions. I think that many or perhaps most of you that are on the call today are diversity practitioners, but I also just want to do some level setting around what we mean by diversity and those many facets or dimensions of diversity. If I could just pause for one more moment. Again, I keep hearing a clicking sound in the background. I don't know, it went away for a little while and now it's back. So if I could just ask people to mute again, thank you. So we tend to focus on the primary facets of diversity or the protected classes of diversity, if you will. But for purposes of facilitating more inclusive, more constructive, inclusive conversations, I want to take this opportunity to remind us about the more holistic approach to thinking about diversity and culture. It certainly is warranted in this context. For instance, when you are talking about issues of where people, when you're talking about some of the issues that we've talked about here, like politics and race relations, how COVID is impacting different people, issues of where you grew up, how you grew up, the messages that you received as you were growing up are implicated. Whether someone comes from a single parent home or a two-parent household or a blended family or was raised by aunts and uncles or grandparents, those aspects of their life, of their culture, will shape their thinking. And of course, we know all too well, especially these days, that political affiliations and the associated ideologies that come with those affiliations are real issues. And those are also facets of the diversity that we are managing and that we are dealing with. Titles and power dynamics in organizations are always in play as well, and another facet of diversity to be mindful of when we're thinking about more inclusive conversations. So I'm going to stop there. I think you kind of get the idea with the different types of diversity that come into play in these conversations. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jamie, to talk a little bit more about how we can leverage all of these different facets of diversity to support the foundation for engaging in more inclusive conversations. Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Janai. So when we think about diversity, which is where we have tended to start, right? Even organizations, for a lot of us that were doing this work years ago, you know, it might be a diversity program manager that existed. No one was talking about inclusion. But we can get to the next slide if you don't mind. Stop moving. So when we think about diversity, right, this is what Janai's just told us about. It's the range of human differences. It's the who that shows up in our workplaces, in our society, right, made up of lots and lots of different cultures that Janai just went over. A lot of times we think that, oh, we work to get the diversity there. And even some people will say, oh, we've got to get more people here. If we have more representation, then like it'll be better. And I think when we think about then people started talking about inclusion, right? And we're getting into some of the historical sort of growth of the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. There are like the acronyms keep getting more and more for some of you who are trying to keep up or keep changing your title, right? But the inclusion is the quality of the human experience, right? How people feel in the environment. This is the what. It's the mix of feeling valued and engaged. And in order to have that mix there, right, we just think the more diverse we make it, then we can just focus on inclusion and everyone's just going to get along, right? And I think even when we think about some of the history around, in particular, if we're just talking in the US for a second, but I think this is common in a lot of parts of the world, right? We have a history of where there was not only like oppression and enslavement, but we had segregation. And then even as in the workforce, as we looked to integrate the workforce more, it became that we can bring more people together, but let's not talk about anything that makes us different. Let's just focus on commonalities. And one of the things we know both through research and through even an assessment called the Intercultural Development Inventory, which Janai is going to hit on a little bit, I think, later, but the IDI assesses your level of intercultural competence, right? Intercultural competence is how effective you are across difference. So when we think about our capability to shift our perspective, to know who am I, what is my culture, what is my belief, shaped by all the things that we've been talking about, right? And what is someone else's? And how do I learn more about this other individual or community of people, right? And how their differences are from mine. And then I can build bridges to be more effective across difference. So it really is the equity and the intercultural competence. And we don't have enough time to dig into all the aspects of equity and how you build systems. Today, we're focused more on how to have those conversations. And really, if we focus more on the how to make that mix work, you not only improve the quality of the experience of inclusion, right? And that sense of belonging that people are looking for, authenticity, all these things we talk about. Everyone wants to bring their authentic self to work. Well, in order to do that and have inclusion, it requires this intercultural competence, this effectiveness across difference. The other thing that we know in the WHO, we can measure our representation, at least in the US and in parts of Canada, for purposes of diversity and inclusion, right? We can track our headcount. We know who exists in our organization. And we keep talking about the lack of retention. We see it in all the data at the highest ranks. And part of that is not just the systems that need to be built, but the humans and how we all interact. And so I tell everyone, this work boils down to two things: human behavioral change and systematic change. And for today, what we'd like to do is help give you some tips on how to create these human changes. And I'm going to turn it over to Nai to get us going with some of these tips.
Great, Jamie. Thank you so much for that. So this is the part where you can probably start, I was going to say pull out your pen and paper, but that's so old-fashioned. So start taking notes. Not surprisingly, this work begins with you, right? And really preparing yourself and being introspective about yourself and what's going on in your head and in your heart. So at a really high level, exploring your own cultural identity. Jamie just talked this a little bit. And I think it's safe to say that culture is more than any one of our identities. It's actually a combination or an intersection of all of the dimensions that we saw on those previous slides. It informs, as Jamie shared with us, how we show up, and even more, how we move around the world, right? I like to think about like moving around the world, even if I'm going like from my home to, the corner grocery store or to the office, but how I move in that space is informed by my cultural identity. What feels safe to me and what does not feel safe is informed by my cultural identity. What I take for granted or what I don't take for granted is informed by my cultural identity. How we greet people. I remember my mom, when I was a kid growing up, my mom hammered this into us, which was always look people in the eye when you're greeting them. See them, look at them, don't look away, don't look down. She was really, really insistent on looking people in the eye when greeting them. And to this day, that's something that is really important to me, making eye contact with people, right? But that's not the same in all cultures, right? We know in some cultures, actually making eye contact can be considered rude, disrespectful. So these are all pieces and parts of our cultural identities. So we need to explore that and kind of dig into it. And even people who, you may have heard people say, well, I don't really have a culture. Oftentimes people from the dominant groups, white, straight, male, will say, I don't really have a culture. You have a culture, right? You definitely have a culture. So exploring that identity and learning more about it is an important first step. Another a step in learning about yourself is identifying your blind spots. So these two are kind of linked, because as you begin to learn more about your own cultural identity, you'll begin to uncover blind spots, biases, assumptions that you may have. There are some great tools out there to help you on this journey. Jamie's already mentioned one of them, the IDI. Another great tool is the implicit association test. I really like the IAT, as we call it for short, for people who are really getting started. And if you're doing some of your own self-learning, the IAT is very accessible. It's available online. It's free. Just Google Harvard IAT, and it will pop up. And you can go on and take several different tests that measure your blind spots and biases. The thing I also like about the IAT is that it's been around for a long time. There's a lot of science behind it. There's a lot of evidence behind it, and they're constantly updating it. So right now there are even tests on the impact of COVID-19 and how people are reacting and the stigma around COVID-19. Related to this is also facing your fears, right? Like, this is hard stuff. And so even admitting, that you have biases can be really, really difficult. Admitting that you may have assumptions or other beliefs about people can be embarrassing, right? If you start to think and start to unpack some of your biases and maybe assumptions, you may discover that you have done things or said things that maybe reinforced racist stereotypes. That's embarrassing, right? And we all do it. No one is immune from this kind of behavior. It may make you feel shameful. It may make you feel vulnerable. You still have to lean into it. So I'm saying this kind of as a precursor. I think knowing that sometimes those are the emotions that can come up in this process of doing your own introspective work is helpful. And know that you're not alone, right? People who are doing this work, like all of you here today, will go through some of these feelings and many, many more. And the more you do it, the more you develop a comfort with it, right? So you learn how to leverage that those feelings and that discomfort, frankly, and to grow and to do more. So sitting with the feelings, ignoring them, and I think really important is to embrace and commit to change. I think the fact that many of you are just here today, I think, is indicative of a willingness and a desire to commit to change and to choose courage. Another resource here that I think is incredibly valuable and I have found helpful in doing this work is the research and writing of Brené Brown. She is brilliant, and it's one of the resources that we'll provide at the end. But anything that Brené Brown has written or spoken about in her TED Talks or in her podcasts, I strongly recommend them. She spends a lot of time talking about courage, vulnerability, inclusive leadership, everything that we're here today to talk about. And then finally, as you're doing this work, you want to start thinking about the privileges and the power that you have, right? We all have different and unique privileges and power, regardless of where we sit. And so thinking about leveraging those advantages to support your similarly situated people, your own growth, and others as well, can be an incredibly powerful process or powerful step in this process as you're thinking about, learning more about yourself and sort of what to do with that information. So I'm going to turn it over to Jamie now to talk a little bit more about this self-work and preparing yourself.
Thanks, Janai. So what Janai was focused on was sort of how do you look inside and learn more about yourself, understanding things about you. And there's a connection between learning about yourself and learning about others. And it starts with all of this, right, is kind of doing your homework, is figuring out ways to learn. And one of the things that I like to remind people of is the aspect of inclusive listening, which is a more reflective kind of listening. It's really being intuitive to hear what is coming up, what others might be saying, but also thinking about what's coming up inside of me when someone says something, or I watch a TED Talk or listen to a podcast, because all the ways to do, there's so many resources right now. A great way too is obviously to commune and spend other time with people, which we know is very limited right now for the safety and security of ourselves and others with COVID-19. And so whether it's a podcast or you're joining a session like this, and when we get to the Q&A, right, or you're hearing things that Janai and I are saying right now, and it's bringing up something for you, acknowledge it. One of the things I often advise leaders that I coach is start a journal. It doesn't have to be like Dear Diary, some big bound thing. It could be you audio voice to yourself once a day, like, hey, this came up when this happened, or I was thinking about this and I don't have time to process it. Even if you took once or twice a week that you scheduled 15 minutes on your calendar, or it was a one time a day debrief that really started to, what are these things that are coming up and how can I be more effective? What do I need to learn? What am I doing well, right? And getting reflective with that. And then part of doing that is gathering your confidence of who you can ask questions to, right? And my number one tip with this that I cannot impress on people enough is no one person is your culture guru, especially at work, right? So when you're looking to learn more about the LGBTQ community, or you're looking to know more and understand more about the Black and African American experience, if you're looking to know more about, all these different identities, whether it's the military, veteran status, all these different aspects about identity, you want to be careful. In particular, if you have that one colleague at work, that is not a well for you to tap on an unlimited supply. So a couple of things, always ask permission first. Give the person space to say no and decline. And then if you ask them and you have a conversation about it, be willing to sit there and actively listen and hear what they're having to say without being defensive in return. And then also look for others outside of the workplace as best as you can, so that you're not putting all of that pressure on your colleagues at work. And so if I can't stress that enough about the sort of no one's your culture guru at work. The other thing I like to call out, if you are a leader on this WebEx, or you're advising a leader, a lot of times leaders will start inside of an organization like a CEO roundtable or a managing partners roundtable, which is made up of a mix of employees that can be a sounding board for that individual, which can be really fantastic way to listen and hear. And I think what's just important is to coach and equip that leader to go into that space to really with that listening tool, and to be careful that you're not, again, over tapping into specific people who, I think this summer we saw, and I had reported from a number of Black professionals that I spoke with that were looking for advice and perspective of like, if one more person asks me how to fix this, why are they asking me to fix something that I didn't create? And so just to be careful in particular for white leaders, white male leaders, white cisgender leaders, and all leaders of different backgrounds, but in particular, when you are in a position of privilege, or you are in a position of the majority, right, that you are being conscious of how you go about getting your confidence, right? And this ties into making it safe to talk about identity and culture. We signal to others that we're open on different topics, right? There are things you can do. So Janai and I both used our pronouns at the start of this session. Using your pronouns in particular, if you are cisgender, makes it safer for those who might want to identify non-binary, or our trans colleagues who may be in the process of sharing a changed pronoun for them. And so it's really, that's one simple way, listing them. You see more people on their LinkedIn, on their Twitter, on their email address at the bottom. I use mine in multiple languages because I want to signal both that I am in a multilingual, multicultural, multiracial family, and the Spanish language is important to us. Also, I'm signaling culturally within the Latinx community, right, that I'm acknowledging gender identity. So there's some layers as to why I'm doing it and how I'm doing it, but those are ways that it signals to others, oh, beyond the fact that if you read my LinkedIn profile, you're like, she does diversity and inclusion, maybe she's open to talking about this, right? But if you don't have a D&I title, that's okay. Like, there's still ways that we can all signal to each other that we're safe, and this ties into how we're mindful, respectful, supportive, and open, to difference. This is where I often talk about, what is it to be to do mindful inquiry? That's what I was talking about before, how you frame your questions. And then what is that reflective pause? You cannot pause enough before responding in an engagement, talking about identity and culture, in particular across difference, because it's inevitable. Someone that is different to us is going to have a different perspective. And if we jump right into our solution or right into like what we think and what we know, we don't acknowledge and really give space for what we've just heard and safety and security for an exchange. So I can't stress enough that if you can take that reflective pause and take that mindful, space, it really can help us engage and learn more about others. So much of this is about how we prepare ourselves and how we stay mindful in the midst of engaging with others. We can go to the next slide. So beyond how we sort of prepare ourselves, the sort of space and place and how you talk about things, right? So what Jen and I have talked about so far, this can be in a one-on-one conversation. This could be with your teams at the office. This can also be hosting a dialogue, right? Numbers of firms. I know Perkins Coie has, I know Seyfarth has, because I've even attended some of Seyfarth's town halls talking about race and identity and culture. When I was at BCG, we established what we called an authentic conversation brand. And it was getting BCGers to be comfortable to talk about identity and culture. And through a number of resources, we were able to quadruple the number of offices participating in a one-year time frame because we started creating this space to get more and more comfortable. And so when you're preparing this space and dialogue, right, when we used to go physically and could convene in an office, thinking about what room, one of the things I often hear as a watch out is if you feel like you got put in the conference room that's in the back corner that nobody really likes, that sometimes has extra books in it, like that doesn't feel very welcoming. So if you're in a physical space, right, Janae, like create it to be welcoming, maybe have some snacks, feed them, they will come.
Some intentionality around it.
Yeah. And always feed them, they will come. And
that's right.
Too. But even on Zoom, like thinking in advance with your colleagues as to, hey, I think we want to facilitate this conversation. There's a lot of people who are engaged. Breakout rooms are going to be important. How do we navigate that, right? So there's ways to plan for that and create more intimacy. And I've seen that in a number of conferences I've gone to where they pop you into a room with 5 people you've never met before. Well, you can get to know 5 people and have a more intimate conversation than you can where you can't see everyone simultaneously on a Zoom call.
And Jamie, if I could quickly interrupt on that, on the Zoom call piece, I think being intentional about, and forgive me if you just said this and I missed it, but being intentional about having the camera on, right? Yeah, because we're doing a lot of these really intimate, courageous, conversations remotely, and so trying to build in that sort of shared space in a in this sort of work from home environment is challenging, really tough. So cameras on, I think, is super, super important.
Yeah, I would say what I like to do in the objectives and ground rules session is talk about the camera, acknowledge the camera. This is how we can convene and see each other. So I also agree that we would have the cameras on. I also like to give one caveat, which is there are times where you've got to collect yourself, and there also could be something else happening in your background that is distracting you from the moment. And so also give permission that if you need to occasionally pause your camera, mute, come off and come back. If that helps you, like we could create that safe space for that, because often somebody could quickly slip out of a room if they were in a meeting and needed to sort of could get themselves in a place that they wanted to be in if something affects them emotionally, let alone the fact that we literally have employees working and having lots going on at home. So that's my one caveat there, but I also agree with that. The other thing, letting your guard down and practicing and modeling empathy. This is so important and really ties in and dovetails into the understanding authenticity and belonging, but also into privilege and power, right? So the more privilege, the more power position you have when you model empathy and letting your guard down and vulnerability, right? And open up about yourself. And so I usually, when I present and speak, I think I'm pretty well known for this, that I share a lot of personal stories. I use storytelling. I weave it in. 1, it helps the concept come to life. But 2, I know that there's an opportunity for me to model vulnerability, for me to model inclusion. Even at times when I make a statement that I catch myself that things like saying you guys a lot and or using different sayings that don't feel inclusive, I will acknowledge that I said them and correct myself mid sentence. Or I will tell a story, and I can remember presenting in front of an audience and feeling really vulnerable afterwards because I had shared more of my story than I had before. And it was really interesting because I had someone in the audience email me afterwards and said, you know, I was questioning whether or not this was the right place for me. But when you got up and told your story and your background and where you come from, and a little bit more about you and what you're bringing to this organization, it made me realize like I can be myself here and I belong here, and my story matters too. And so there's a lot of power in that. And I meet a lot of leaders who will say like, oh, well, I didn't know what it was like. I'm the first in my family to go to college or become a lawyer or become a scientist or an engineer. And I'll say, do you tell anyone that? And most of them will go, no. And it's because of a generation of how they got there. They came in a time we didn't talk about it. Well, guess what? Now to create more authenticity and belonging and connection is to share your story. And in sharing your story, don't assume somebody's story is just like yours, right? So I'm a white woman, right? There's a lot of things that when you see me on the screen, you've probably put me in all these different boxes of what you think. The more facts I give you, like the fact that I was born to a single mom, or that I'm the first in my family to go to college, I have the highest level of education in my biological father's family, like all of those things just reframed a whole bunch of information that put me in a whole different bunch of spaces in your brain, right? But I don't presume that someone who looks like me or someone who looks different than me has the same story as me. But when I share my story, I make it safe for them to share their story. And so this is really, our ability to create that space in a room matters. So choosing how you facilitate these conversations, whether that is the person that's doing what Janai and I are doing sort of in the big picture conceptually, the main facilitator, the main speaker, or I can't stress enough how important breakout facilitators are. So if you're hosting something like I described as a town hall or the authentic conversations that I described, I know we hosted things that were all offices involved. And so we did a train the trainer in advance with all the small group facilitators. We gave them framework of how to walk through the conversation, questions that they can navigate, tips for what they might incur, like what might happen, kind of talk through how to run, the group. Having a conversation in a formal way where you bring people together is like having an event, and it doesn't just magically happen that everyone has a good time and everybody connects with each other, right? There are things at an event planner, right, they put into place to help them happen. Conversations that we're facilitating on topics around inclusion and diversity and equity and culture and identity, right? We want them to be purposeful. So anything you can do to help your facilitators in advance can really prepare them well. And I think this is a good time to turn over to Janai that's going to talk about some of the do's and don'ts of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I jump into that, though, I wanted to just dovetail off of your two things that you said, Jamie. One was just sort of feeling vulnerable after you'd shared more about your personal story in one instance. And then also the power of being able to do that as a leader, right? And sort of modeling what telling your story, what opening up can look like. Someone gave me some great advice years ago because I am one who was not comfortable sharing my story and feeling really vulnerable about it. And coming from a household where we were actually taught, one of the sort of cultural lessons that I received was we don't talk about ourselves. We don't talk about our business. We don't talk about what's going on. We don't talk about our challenges, nothing, right? So no information. So it took me a long time to get to a point where I was comfortable sharing. And the advice that I got from this mentor was decide in advance what you're going to share. And sort of frame that in your head. Like, I'm going to talk about my education and the fact that I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college. And just identify discrete bits of information that you are comfortable sharing, kind of practice it. And then when you're in that space where it's helpful to share, to model, you can go straight to that information that you've already decided that you're going to share. And it's much more, having done it, I can say that it gave me so much comfort, and it is empowering. Like you really do feel, you just feel much more in control and less vulnerable. So
Yeah,
Just wanted
it's
to
a
share
great
that.
perspective.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we're now at the point where you're actually like in the conversation, right? Like you're one-on-one, or you're in the room, at the front of the room, or you're working, you're participating, facilitator that you've trained is sort of guiding things, and you're there to provide that support. So we've got a few discrete things to, that are sort of the must-dos and really critically important to engage while you're in the conversation. And then, of course, also some things to avoid, and why. These lists are by no means exhaustive, but kind of the highlights, the top 10, if you will. So the first one is just to practice active listening. Jamie's already talked a little bit about this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But essentially, it's so important to give the conversation your full attention, and not to be multitasking on your device, or thinking about what you're going to say in response to the person, or thinking of a clever question to ask them. No, you are just there to listen, undivided attention. As you're engaging in those conversations, it's also helpful to really own your statements and to own your questions. So really framing them as, what I hear you saying is X, instead of saying, you just said X, right? Which sounds much more um, accusatory and less open for that conversation. When you say, what I hear you saying is X, it conveys that you really have been listening, so you can kind of repeat back what the person has said. And what you may discover is that the person to whom you are engaging in this conversation with, or whose words you are sharing with them, may realize that they said something in a way that maybe they didn't intend it, right? And so I've actually engaged in this before and had people say to me, well, I didn't mean it that way. I'm like, well, okay, that's good to know. That's what I received. That's what I heard. So it's nice to be able to sort of own the statement and say, this is what I'm hearing. You also want to be able, you want to be specific in describing behaviors and impacts. So I just gave an example of letting somebody know that this is what you received and how you heard their comments. The same applies for the emotional impact of words, right, or actions. So really letting people know how they made you feel is so critically important. And so, you can say to someone like, when I hear you say that you don't see color, that makes me feel invisible. My color is very much a part of my identity. And when you say you don't see color, I feel like you don't see me, right? Um, that's pretty powerful, right? When you can articulate that back to someone who's like, well, I just, everybody's the same, right? And they may be well-intentioned, but for those of us who've been on the receiving end of those kinds of comments, we know the impact and how that feels. I also like a tip that some people use, which is to find a word that just kind of like puts it out there. So this is really good for one-on-one conversations and people with whom maybe you work closely and you're trying to develop this dialogue, and maybe it's an ongoing dialogue or an ongoing issue. But simply to use the word ouch when they say something that is hurtful, right? That has that negative impact. And that's kind of the buzzword, right? That sort of stops the whole conversation, allows you to reframe it, allows the other person to reframe it as well, and to get a do-over, right? So I really like using words like that. Asking questions to learn more and to use affirmative statements. So statements like, can you tell me more about X? How did this affect you? Because you're really digging in, trying to learn more. So again, we're conveying that we are hearing them. We're providing that affirmation that we're there, that we're listening, that they're valued. And we're not making assumptions, right? So we're asking them to explain more about what they mean. And I'll say a little bit more about that, because gone too far, that can actually be a bad thing. So we'll talk about that distinction in just a moment. And then Jamie's already touched on this, just really displaying empathy, caring, respect. So you do that through, some of the social cues, right? Nodding, genuinely nodding and being interested, not, the sort of fake version of that. Open body language, arms open as opposed to crossed, those kinds of things. Leaning in, Again, none of this should be contrived because that does not feel right, and that's going to have just the opposite effect. But again, just being aware and sensitive to those nonverbal communications. So a little bit about, go ahead, Jamie, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, before we jump to the avoid list, one thing that occurs to me that maybe we haven't said yet, and this is a part of like having the objectives and being clear about what the purpose of the discussion is. So many of us are problem solvers. Our job is to solve clients' problems. So when we walk into a room, we should be coming in to solve the problem, right? And these conversations aren't actually about solving something. And I think that's often what happens in whether it's a dialogue or a conversation around culture, or a workshop talking about inclusive leadership or unconscious bias or whatever it is, right? But these dialogues and conversations, everyone's like, okay, how are we solving the problem? And it's like, no, we're skill building, we're practicing, this is nuanced. Like, yes, and there are times that we're going into a room to solve problems and we're building strategy. That's a different kind of conversation, right? So as you were talking about it, of the things to do, some of it is that shift of reminding yourself you're not just here to solve things. And I think when people get into that mindset, they turn all of the do list off and engage in the avoid list that you're about to talk about. But I just thought that was a call out that we should probably share to the audience, because I think it's just happening in so many organizations.
You are absolutely 1,000% right. I could not agree with you more. Yeah. And in fact, I think being aware of that is also important, because for so many of these issues, there really isn't an answer. Like there isn't an answer that everyone's going to agree on, or even two people are going to agree on, right? So what we're trying to do is get to a point where we hear and respect each other more, and we're allowed, we feel like it's a safe environment to share respectfully, to learn more about the other person, to learn more about ourselves, what might be offensive about what we're saying, and demonstrating that care. But we're not, as Jamie said, we're not trying to solve a particular, we're not trying to get people to agree necessarily, or to solve the problem. Or as I've been saying all year, we're not going to solve racism by the end of the year, right? Like that's just not going to happen. So we've got to take some steps in between. Yeah,
I was just going to say, but that how all of us that are in this work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we build cultural competence every single day. We're building muscles all the time. That's how we're able to create strategy and think through solutioning, that we get to solutions. But we are practicing these things that we're trying to get others to practice, because no organization changes because one of us or a team of 10 of us in an organization are rolling up our sleeves to do it. Organizations change because the whole collective is engaged, right? That's where this becomes so important, that building that muscle memory.
Absolutely. So quickly, things to avoid: interrupting. I think we kind of talked about that in the context of making sure that we're doing the active listening. Judgment and minimizing differences in experiences, right? So especially if you're from, we're all going to hear things that are inconsistent with our own life experiences, right? And especially if we're from the dominant culture, right? We're going to hear things like, that's not how it was for me, or what the majority of people experience, so on and so forth. So being mindful of that, and really trying to not engage in feedback and other communication that challenges that person's experience, because in challenging their experience, you're actually minimizing their difference, their experience. You're minimizing them as a human, right? And all of their cultural identities. So just being mindful of that. Getting defensive is something that happens. It's sort of a natural reaction, right? Especially for many of us type A personalities, and those of us who are problem solvers, so on and so forth. You get frustrated, you get defensive, you don't understand what I meant. This is what I meant, and how dare you attack me for being a well-intentioned human, all kinds of things, right? Try to resist that as much as you possibly can. Again, it's a muscle that requires some exercising, and so it's going to take some practice. I will say that constructive feedback is a gift, and sometimes it's not delivered in a pretty package. But when someone shares with you, this is how you made me feel, or this is the impact this is having on me, or when you did this, it was an ouch moment, whatever, that stuff that may make us want to get defensive is actually really good information to have, right? Because it sort of identifies where our blind spots are and things that we can start working on. We don't want to discount and dismiss others. I think that's really similar to minimizing the experiences and differences that we all have. And then finally, doubling down on your opinion is not a constructive practice by any means, right? So trying to prove or validate, your opinion, what you really, really meant, that's not going to help foster, this inclusive conversation. So again, being open, receiving that feedback, and learning more about the blind spots. Not easy. I will not say it's easy. And as someone who has received constructive feedback in the past, and I hope I continue to, because I will continue to learn. It's a little, it takes a little getting used to, right? And but it is truly a gift. So I'm mindful of the time. Yeah. So we should probably get on to some of the some common pitfalls that are sort of related to these don'ts, right? Or things to avoid.
Yeah. So a few pitfalls just to keep in mind before we go into the Q&A. And I think what Janai was really just getting at is this idea of intention versus consequence, right? And so, and the reason intention is crossed out on the slide, if you're looking at it, is because pure intentions can still have impure outcomes or consequences, right? So you can have this well-intentioned thought, idea, thing you're going to do, but you didn't consider certain lenses, maybe because you didn't have the awareness yet, right? The growth mindset. But it still has those consequences. And so just being mindful that it's not enough, and it's so hard, right? When we're now in a place where people are trying to say like, hey, when you said that, and using the I language, it made me feel this way. The response is, and I've done this, I have made this mistake and humbly had to come back and apologize and own it, which is, that was not my intention. I didn't mean to do that, right? And especially like as a leader, you're moving quickly, you're doing things, you might offend someone, you hurt someone's feelings, you didn't realize that how much it meant to the team when you just brushed over that thing they did, right? It doesn't even have to be really specifically about culture, but then it can be also, right, about culture and identity. So just be mindful that intentions are really only part of it. So consequences are really the outcomes of the interaction. And then thinking about privilege versus subjugation, what I like is Dr. Kenneth Hardy out of New York City. He's a psychologist. He runs a couple different institutes in New York, and he talks about this idea that this multidimensional view of self, right? This goes back to all the elements that Janai shared, and we talked about diversity, right? The who, and elements about, and this is one of the challenges of how we've started to use the word diverse, right? People are not actually diverse. Groups, organizations, teams, you can describe them as diverse. There are elements of diversity, right, that people possess. We've started to use that as the catchphrase. And I think that the trouble with that sometimes is we all have these multidimensional parts of ourselves, right? And some of them at different points are in a position of privilege versus subjugation, or we've used the word majority or dominant group. And we use dominant and non-dominant, right? Because it's sort of the group that has often the most power, which is the most privilege as well. So just being mindful of this, and that element shifts. And when you're communicating with others, if somebody shares a story about something that happened to them that was a form of anything from like a microaggression to, some form of oppression or something offensive that happened to them, right? And your first thought is, oh, I kind of know this because as a woman, right? For Janai and I'm like, oh, well, as a woman, I've totally had this happen. And she's speaking as a woman of color, or more specifically as a Black woman, right? And I've somehow invalidated her experience and sort of hijacked that conversation and made it more about me. And the gender. And it doesn't mean that we don't sometimes still have that gender in common, right? But I don't want to hijack the experience that she was sharing. Now, as an aside from that, as a white woman who's in a multiracial family, right? If I'm talking about the experience of my fear for my young daughters of color and their safety and security at college, or fill in the blank of things, right? That might be somewhere where I can connect on that. even though I am not a woman of color, right? So there are things in which we might have a conversation, but how we frame the conversation matters. And being aware of our privilege in that conversation versus subjugation plays a role, which also ties into this last point I'll make before we open up more and move towards Q&A, is that empathy versus priv empathy. And this is that sort of privileged empathy that Dr. Hardy talks about. And he was, talking about how that hijacking that occurs, right? It takes away from the person that is trying to articulate a challenge that has occurred, or, a position that they've been in, or somehow in a way that they've felt. And we diminish that. And I don't think that, again, going back to intentions, is what someone thought or intended to do. And so while you might seem generous or empathetic, the conversation moves away from the person that has just expressed this, and really results in the person in a position of privilege focusing on an element of greater privilege than the subjugation that person just sort of articulated. And so these pitfalls, and even if you look at this picture, what drew me to it is this idea that while these are challenges, these are all overcome. Like, you can overcome these challenges, right? With the tips and strategies that we've given you today and more, right? And we'll share a resource list later that will also give you strategies and tips and more ways to learn. These are actionable things you can do that improve the outcome of the engagements and create more inclusive conversations. It is absolutely possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And one other just quick note, there's been a lot of talk, over the past year about this concept of allyship. In fact, I think I did something on allyship for this project. And there's just been so much out there. And in the allyship conversation, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, we talk a lot about centering, right? And sort of putting as the ally, one of the pitfalls that allies should avoid is the idea of putting themselves front and center, being the loudest voice, right? Being out there, out front on behalf of others. But as a result of that, receiving all of the attention and having their issues and their bodies literally in the center of the issue. And it's somewhat related to this concept of empathy versus priv empathy. Another related concept is the concept of being a savior, right? Or feeling sympathy for people in marginalized communities or marginalized groups, and like writing in to be the savior and get all of the attention and get all the credit and all of those kinds of things. So we just want to be mindful of it. It feels good, right, to get the credit and to get the recognition for doing good work, for doing quote unquote the right thing, but it is actually not the right thing in this context. So just wanted to add that related note. Okay, so I'm not sure how do we do Q&A? Is it through the chat box or do people unmute?
It'll be through the Q&A. It's on your right-hand side.
Okay, through the chat box. Okay. I don't know if we have any questions yet, based on what I'm seeing. Do you see anything?
Just one. Not sure if it's a question. Rules on sharing, not just from the perspective of authenticity, but also courage and vulnerability, is to share what you have
healed from.
Sorry, it's very small. What you don't need affirmation from, what is yours to share, and what you are ready to further discuss, guidelines. And that's about it.
So there's a question
lot packed in there.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to take a stab at it first, or?
Are they asking for guidelines? Or was that a statement that was made? And then there's the next question.
I think that was just
a statement.
I think it's just a statement. Yeah.
So
yeah.
The next question, you mean though? Somebody in the chat box said, I recently read an article saying that many Latino Americans do not use the term Latinx, and a significant number do not know what it means. What is the recommended approach for using this term? I'll start, and if you want to chime in.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Very complex because everything in the Spanish language is gendered. Everything you describe, every verb, and it's tricky because I was even digging into this as someone who is a part of a household that has Latinos, Latinas represented. We use Latino, Latina, and Latinx it is a way to show gender inclusivity, gender identity, inclusivity in the Spanish language or in the Latin X community or Latino community. So you'll see them used interchangeably. There is not a one completely agreed upon rule. It's sort of like, but it is one that is, people have been using it more and more to infer, in particular, where both culturally and within communities, it can be difficult for people to embrace non-binary, and people don't really know what to do with the non-binary, both in identity and just like reducing that binary existence. And so while you won't hear it used everywhere, and it's still completely okay to say Latino or Latina, saying Latinx and how you pronounce it is Latinx or something along those lines is the appropriate way to pronounce it, is perfectly fine to use. I would say if you're taking a pulse, college campuses, most student groups use the gender neutral Latinx. So again, you will see that in various forms, but it is not like this is the only way and only use this versus using this. You will see probably as many articles for it in support of it as many articles saying, I don't know if I like it. But that is also a comfort around language when there is no real gender neutral in the Spanish language.
Yep. I will also just add that I've recently learned that that there kind of like the difference between Hispanic and Latino or Latina sometimes is a matter of preference. Sometimes it's a matter of from where in the diaspora you come from, or your heritage, what your heritage is. The same thing with the Latinx is that some people feel that it is a term that has been derived and imposed by Western society, by American society, and they are also resistant to it for those reasons and want to have more control over that language and don't mind the fact that it is so gendered and prefer to do Latino and Latina. I've seen it also break down along generational lines as well, preferences and the use of that. So it's always good to ask people what their preference is, if they have a preference, or to just acknowledge that it is this. We have this range. We have it's sort of a broad range of options there.
Yeah.
I see a few more questions have come in.
Yeah, there's a good question here asking, can you provide tips for BIPOC individuals who are engaged in inclusive conversation attempts, but don't feel heard or seen by those around them, or worse, feel like they are carrying an emotional load? This is very relevant.
Yeah. So, oh gosh, we have 2 minutes remaining. I'm not going to be able to do this do this question justice, but I will say for BIPOC individuals, and just to clarify what we mean by BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So it's an acronym that has emerged more recently to talk about Black and Indigenous people of color in this society. And I think what the question, the person who asked the question is getting at is just sort of the emotional weight of all of this, right? What we have called historically the diversity tax, and also the racial trauma around the experiences and these issues. And so my first, recommendation is to want to acknowledge that you're feeling this trauma, feeling this pain, and to take care of you. One of the things that we've been really clear about at my firm is providing lots of resources, open dialogue and communication around these issues, and really providing the space for people to develop the strength to engage in the inclusive conversation or to opt out and opting out is perfectly fine. You know, as Jamie said earlier, this is not the burden of people of color. And so it's okay to not participate in the inclusive conversation. And if you find yourself in the inclusive conversation, you start to feel those emotions, you know, stepping away, stepping out is fine. For the facilitators, one of the things that I always encourage is to take a pause, right? Stop the conversation, allow people to take a breath, to gather themselves. This is hard stuff. It's really hard stuff. And so it requires a number of different disciplines and coping mechanisms. So there's more there, but in the interest of time, did you want to add anything to that, Jamie, before we jump to the resources?
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things you could do as well is depending on where your organization is at and what you need. Like I've done this for clients where we do a little bit of focus group kind of priming before you have a dialogue, and we actually break it out. So there is one for people of color, there's a separate one for white employees, and some might say, oh my gosh, you're going to separate people, but you're holding space, and you would actually be surprised how much people open up and they want to ask these questions in a safe environment that they're not going to hurt or offend someone else. And again, there's not enough time. There's a more complex way of how you would structure and set that up. So I would just say if that's something you want to do, definitely engage someone who has expertise in it so that you do it effectively. Because the way you message it, the way you frame it, how you do it really does matter. But that is also another thing to do as a stepping stone or a resource throughout the journey of holding these conversations.
Yeah, really great point. Thanks, Jamie. Okay, and as we wrap up here, we just wanted to share this resource, this list of resources. There's some, you know, again, we're not even scratching the surface of this list, but these are some of our favorites from Jamie and also from myself. There are podcasts and something for everyone, TED Talks, so on and so forth. And once you get started, if you haven't started doing this kind of research yet, you will discover that there is so much more out there. Thank you so much. And I am looking for the CLE code. I was just reminded to provide that. Okay, I have the CLE code. The CLE code is SS as in summer, 2410, SS 2410. And there will also be attendance forms that will be provided to you via email that you can complete as well. So those will be emailed to you after today's webinar. So I think that's it, Jamie. This has been a wonderful opportunity to join all of you to have this important conversation. I wish we had more time because there was so much that we did not, you know, that we weren't able to get into and to go deeper. But feel free to be in touch directly with Jamie. She's, you know, in her capacity, is doing a lot of training in organizations, and I think would be a great resource. And I'm also happy to be a resource to anyone who would like it. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you all very much for joining us. Have a good weekend.